The topic I chose for my observational research study was the deviance behind the act of jaywalking. In my experience, jaywalking is a common behavior among students at Seattle University, so my observations took place at two intersections within and around the SU campus. At James and Cherry and 12th and Columbia, I observed as a covert observer to look at the trends surrounding jaywalkers and non-jaywalkers and determine whether jaywalking can even be considered a deviant act anymore. I was curious about the origin of jaywalking as a deviant label, so outside of my field observations, I researched and found that the term jaywalking arose in the early 1920s as a mode of propaganda perpetrated by the motor vehicle industry that was booming at the time. The label arose to place blame on pedestrians that were victims of accidents involving motor vehiclists because the large number of injuries threatened and could have possibly hurt the large auto companies that were in power at the time. This demonstrates the notion that deviance is defined by the powerful, and the label arises in response to the conflict and differing ideals of each group involved. Before and after this uproar in the 1920s, there were not and have not been any more largely successful campaigns against jaywalking, and for this reason I chose to study the act as a deviant behavior. I wanted to look at the evolving repercussions surrounding jaywalking, if there are any more at all, like other many more significantly lawfully deviant acts have. Before I could make any observations, I had to define what jaywalking was. According to Washington state laws as of 2013, jaywalking includes prohibited crossing the street, entering the street outside of a crosswalk, jaywalking between signals, prohibited crossing of a median barrier, prohibited crossing of an arterial street, and crossing the intersection diagonally, as well as the latest addition to the Washington state laws, entering an intersection while the stop signal is flashing. This last law, as well as many others, show that over time the laws surrounding jaywalking have evolved and become more specific instead of a broad term to describe the act. Before considering multiple theories of deviance, I wanted to determine whether jaywalking could even be considered a deviant act anymore using a simple definition of the word. A majority group would be considered non-deviant, while a minority group would be considered deviant. To do this, I used a two-proportion statistical analysis test and found that technically jaywalking is deviant. This is because the proportion of non-jaywalkers was significantly higher than the proportion of jaywalkers total. I also used this same statistical analysis test to look at the differences in jaywalkers at each intersection and found that the proportion of jaywalkers at James and Cherry was significantly higher than the proportion of jaywalkers at 12th and Columbia. This was most likely due to the increase of traffic at 12th and Columbia, unlike James and Cherry. I performed a final statistical analysis to test the differences of gender in jaywalkers. Although there is a significant difference in the genders of students that attend Seattle University, there being a significantly higher number of females at the school than males, I found that there was no significant difference between male jaywalkers and female jaywalkers. This is most likely due to the fact that one of the intersections I observed, 12th and Columbia, was outside of campus, and there was a larger population of non-student adults that I observed using intersections during my observation times. The purpose of these tests was to make a comparison between my findings and the reported number of citations given to jaywalkers in Washington state. I found that over the years, the number of citations given has dropped continuously, despite the fact that my data says that the number of jaywalkers is still much higher than what is reported by Washington state. Now we can look at multiple theories of deviance surrounding jaywalking. We saw that repercussions regarding jaywalking have decreased significantly over the years, which can easily be related to the relative theory of deviance. Although once under the control of the motor vehicle industry, jaywalking as a deviant act is technically lawfully deviant, which means it is now under control of the law enforcement. In relativity to other acts of deviance, jaywalking does not have as many legal repercussions as others. So therefore, it is most likely that it has taken a backseat in priorities of law enforcement and is not enforced as much because there are other more significant crimes that need to be enforced. Over the course of my field observations, I began to notice other trends in jaywalkers and non-jaywalkers. Throughout the 15 hours, I noticed 18 total groups of pedestrians that arrived at the crosswalk together and either jaywalked together or waited for the signal to turn together. Of those 18 groups, I noticed 4 where the majority of the group either began to jaywalk or waited, while one person of the group either jaywalked ahead of the group or stayed behind. Although these groups were separated at first, that singular person eventually either joined the jaywalking group or returned back to the sidewalk to join their group and wait for the light. That one individual is a prime example of Goffman's theory of in-group mentality or in-group alignment. An in-group is an exclusive group of people who share the same ideals, or in this case, share the same label as jaywalker or non-jaywalker. Although jaywalkers may not see themselves as the deviant group, we've previously established that of the two, jaywalking is the deviant act, except in these situations where the majority of the group jaywalks, where one individual stays behind and waits for the light. The same goes for the corresponding situation where the majority of the group waits for the light and one individual jaywalks, and we see that that one individual then becomes the deviant of the group. Goffman writes that our nature and our characteristics are defined by our group affiliations, and the fact that each of these individuals that were essentially deviant at the beginning eventually joined their groups shows how important not being stigmatized by the group is and group acceptance is to being a participating member of that group. Another trend I began to notice in my observations was the theory of differential association. This is simply defined as learning to commit a crime by observing and imitating the behaviors of others around you. There were multiple occasions in which I noticed a singular person arrive at the crosswalk, wait for the light, and then begin to jaywalk after a second person arrived behind them and jaywalked in front of them. This follows the steps of differential association because the original person was not formally deviant and became deviant once they copied the behavior of the person in front of them. A different example of this differential association was when two female subjects arrived at the intersection together while the motor vehiclists had the right of way. Soon, the traffic signal turned yellow and one individual began to point at the signal, and while talking to her partner, they began to jaywalk. Here, I made the assumption that the individual that pointed at the light was indicating to her partner that since the light was yellow, they could begin to cross the street since the walk signal would turn on a few seconds later. This is an example of differential association because one individual was teaching the other that they could engage in the deviant act of jaywalking because there would be less of a harm from oncoming traffic since the light was yellow and they would soon be able to walk safely. These were the most obvious trends of jaywalkers and non-jaywalkers that I observed, but there was other qualitative data as well. Since my study was limited to intersections on or near campus, it makes sense that the majority of my subjects would be younger college-age students and not older adults. Younger students and older adults were placed into these categories based on my perceptions of their age and what I assumed a college-age student would dress like or what I assumed a non-college-age adult would dress like. Although these numbers were not equal, I still noticed a larger number of younger students jaywalking compared to the older adults, which perpetuates the idea that deviance is typically limited to the younger generation, a theory that goes back to the early 1900s. Now that we've discussed how my observational findings relate to theories of deviance, we can discuss the implications of these findings. I originally posed the question of whether jaywalking can even be considered a deviant act anymore. Although my statistical analysis says yes, it can be, my observational findings show that jaywalking is much more prevalent than Seattle law enforcement can account for. The implications of my findings on in-group alignment and differential association go hand in hand. With in-group alignment, we found that an individual who had originally not planned on jaywalking eventually did so to maintain their position as a non-deviant member of the group. With differential association, we saw another individual who had originally not planned to jaywalk eventually did so after imitating the behavior of the person before them. These both show that people will engage in the deviant behavior even if they understand that it is deviant, whether to maintain a social standing or because it is more efficient than what they had originally planned. But the implications of the study only provide a preliminary glance at the deviance behind jaywalking. A more in-depth observational study could provide a deeper understanding of trends regarding jaywalkers and non-jaywalkers, and possibly further answer the question of whether jaywalking is a deviant act. Overall, though, the results of the study begin to provide an understanding of what does or doesn't make a person jaywalk, and shows that even though jaywalking is still lawfully deviant, it is by no means as morally or socially deviant as it once was.